Welcome everyone to another episode of the Perceptive podcast here on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. I am Josh Beiser, and for this week's episode, we are going to be talking to some student game developers. We're kind of going back to class for our topic this week. As for my regulars watching, you know we always like to talk with developers who are working on projects, but I'm also interested in discussing more about how things are going in the academia space. What are students learning about game dev, and what is going on when it comes to teaching it? So my guests tonight are a student game dev group out of the Pennsylvania area, so they're really local to me here on the East Coast. And we're gonna have a little bit chat about what it's like to learn game dev in, well, as we're recording this just at the end of 2022. So I've had to switch in my big game dev roundtable since we have a full house. So I'm going to give everyone a chance to go around and introduce themselves. So we'll go from Ethan to Braden to Thomas. So guys, feel free to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is Ethan Whiting. I am a game designer at Drexel University. My area of study is mostly in the production side of game development. I've been doing this, ever since I was in college, and I'm a third year.
Okay, hello YouTube. I'm Braden Kovalovich. I'm a second year at Drexel Game Design. I love handling the sort of nuts and bolts coding side of projects. And yeah, I guess that's about it.
Hi, I'm Thomas Luden. Just like Ethan, I'm a third year in Drexel's game development program. And when it comes to game design, I honestly really like sound design, kind of the marketing aspects of it, and really just anything I can produce is honestly really fun for me.
Great. It is a pleasure to have the three of you on. For those of you watching this recorded, we met through the Fellowship of Philly Gamers. It's a group that is trying to reignite the East Coast, or more specifically, the Pennsylvania game dev space. And I'm hoping we can see some more great things out of them in the coming months. So, gentlemen, it is great to have you on. So, for people watching us record right now, have you done or have you finished any game projects as a group yet?
Yeah, so we actually finished our first game project as a group back in September of 2022. This was a game called Starhound, and it was made by the three of us and one of our friends, Bridget, who was kind of like our all-purpose artist for that particular project. That one we definitely stuck to our hats, and we worked on that for about a year, starting in November of 2021.
Okay. So, for the three of you, again, like a lot of the guests I spoke to are definitely more, I would say, either like veterans or at least they've had like many years in terms of wanting to get into game dev or building their titles. For the three of you, like, what made you all interested in learning game dev, or specifically going to Drexel to learn game dev?
For me specifically, I chose Drexel because of their co-op program. I was kind of struggling to find schools that had a game development major to begin with, and knowing that jobs kind of in the game industry can be pretty limiting. I thought, getting experience in college and joining clubs through Drexel specifically could really benefit my co-op experience. So last year, like I had a co-op working at a game studio. So I already have a little bit of experience, and I'm only in my third year of college. So I'm hoping that by the time I come out of college, I can be pretty well versed, or at least think I'm prepared to tackle an actual position.
Yeah, on my end, I mean, I've always loved games. It was definitely my escape throughout my childhood, and I feel like whenever I enjoy something, my first instinct is to try to make it. So, when I was around 12 or 13, I just started uh, throwing myself at any coding task I could, and it just sort of blossomed into this broad love for games and the design of them. And why Drexel? I grew up outside the Philly area, so I was very intimately knowledgeable about Philly. It was comforting. It was basically in my backyard. Um, and just having a campus sort of nestled in between the streets of Philly just made a lot of sense for me. And I love the game design program. So
Yeah, for me, it's a very similar story to Braden. I'd say the only thing I would add on top of that is I originally wasn't thinking of being a game designer going into college because, right, that seems like such a like an unrealistic major, where that was my thought at least. So I was like, oh, I'm gonna do something like engineering. But when I actually looked at the schools and their programs, Drexel was like one of the most highly rated, and I was like, oh, I know Drexel. Drexel's right there. And so I took a shot and I made it, and here we are.
And it's certainly been a very, I guess, different path for me when it comes to like learning game design, game dev. When I was in college, feels like 40 years ago, but it was only in like 2005. That was that period where there were just like no schools, especially here on the East Coast side of things, that were really dedicating themselves seriously to game dev. As I've said the story many times for people watching, my college was going to phase out their whole computer science program after my class. And I would find like a year or two later, that's when they would actually finally start adopting a game dev and a game design course. But it has certainly come a long way. And I guess for the three of you, I'm just curious, again, as someone who has not had a college scene in a very long time, what has it been like, I guess, like looking at colleges around here, East Coast wise, in terms of like game dev courses, or like what is that kind of state at now?
Yeah, so that's actually a great question because like when I talked about that list of the top game design schools, a lot of them when I clicked on their their theoretical game design program, it was a mixed digital media program. And that's what Drexel's was for a long time. I would say up until about 2010, my date could be wrong there. But I think Drexel was one of the few schools that has had success with like programs such as the entrepreneurial game studio, where they were like willing to take the risk and say, hey, let's found a program like this. I don't think you'll find that in many other schools, at least on the East Coast, you know.
Yeah, kind of piggyback off of what Ethan was saying. I definitely agree. I think that, especially for game design nowadays, it's an industry that's really moving and increasing fast. It feels like what it was 10 years ago is an entirely new ballgame from what it is now. So applying to schools was kind of difficult because everybody had their own interpretation of game design. Some of it was strictly art, some of it was in the engineering schools and programs. So Drexel for me was kind of the perfect mix, or at least of what I wanted to do. Um, so yeah, definitely with Drexel, I've been able to join EGS and kind of have a stronger stance of what I consider game design to be.
And to that point, I actually spent my first year as a college student at RIT, and I moved or I transferred back to Drexel because I just preferred that experience. And having both sides of that coin, RIT was a lot more about the development side, and Drexel casts a lot wider of a net. I feel like game design in general is just a field that is experimental. So teaching that is sort of a tall order, and I don't think any school has perfected that for you. Like if you're a, math major, like you have to learn this material and then you'll graduate. Games are different. Um and I think some colleges struggle to sort of define what that means. Um but as a student, I think the best advice I can give is to just learn to adapt and learn to never be satisfied with your current course, because there can overnight you can sort of change what that means for you.
Yep, and like 2 or 3 of your points, that was one of the things that when I was trying to find colleges back again in the early 2000s, again, there was no real like game dev scene. I'm gonna really date myself with this one, but there was stuff like oh man, the Art Institute. Like this was like back in like 1998, early mid 2000s. That was kind of like if you want to do anything that's like not like traditional, this was the only place in town. And of course, they went out. I want to say, I can't even remember like when I heard that they went out. But to your points about trying to learn game design, that again, like that's kind of where I built my whole channel on. Is that it's a very nebulous topic in terms of trying to figure out what is and what isn't good game design. And like to your points about kind of like mixed media and trying to like wrap up in something else, that's also that challenge because just because you learn programming or you're a really good artist doesn't necessarily mean that translates into making a good platformer or what makes a good first person shooter or a puzzle game. And the actual learning of game design aspect, I still feel that it isn't given, I think, enough credit. But I guess for the three of you, again, as students in game design courses, like, what do you learn? Like, again, I've not had the chance to do this myself, but what is it like learning or taking a course on game dev today?
I can go first, unless Tommy, you want
You
to
got
take
it. You
this
got it.
one. Okay, cool. Yeah, that's actually a big like you struck a lot of chords there because a lot of game design students in Drexel are asking this about the program that we're taking. Um, what you actually learn in the classroom, I think, is like it's like say game design was a long hallway. Drexel's just showing you the door.
Mm.
It really is, and I think a lot of our experience as game designers has come from what we do outside of the classroom. And I'm a firm defender of that thought. But as for like the actual classes that we take, I mean, there's a few coding classes, there's a few animation classes, there's some like actual sit down, think about what makes a game good, what makes a game bad, game theory, and proper playtesting and QA. But I feel like a lot of times it like when you think of academia, it's something that you can structure and measure. And when you think of game design as this very nebulous topic, it can be very hard to accurately test students on that. So I don't think Drexel really has the teeth to sink into some of those more nebulous programs.
Yeah, I'd agree, honestly. I think that maybe not specifically Drexel, but going back to what I was saying a minute ago, game design is such a new hot topic, I think, or at least it's growing so fast that it changes every 5, 10 years. So how we teach it, I don't know, I think really changes.
Hmm.
But I feel like at Drexel specifically, there are a lot of classes where I'm like, wow, this was super, super helpful. And then there are other classes that I'm like, I'm not sure why I'm taking this in terms of game design. But I think that's maybe a pattern that you would see in terms of any game design major. Because talking with other people from different schools, it seems like that's a common trait in terms of game design, just because it's so new or like a hot topic at least.
Yeah, and I feel like to your guys' points about classes that may not hit the points that you want or may even leave you disappointed. I just finished my second out of the three 3D animation courses that we have to take, and I have to say it was probably one of the most difficult courses I've ever taken, just because of the difficulty of the material. And it's not something I can apply to my career, but in taking those classes and learning that you might not be learning what you want to, it sort of propels you to look outside the classroom. And I think that's honestly a valuable skill. I think a lot of people in other majors get way too comfortable at just going to class, learning what they need to, and leaving to resume their, you know, normal lives. But to me, game dev is my normal life, and it just sort of, one thing leads to another. It doesn't just stay in the classroom. So that's one thing I really love about Drexel
Mm.
game design.
Yeah, and before you move on, I will double back and say like as someone who is trying to go through as a producer in production, like I'll agree with Braden, like even though I might not like what's being taught in the classrooms, getting exposed to a bunch of different mediums helps me understand how different people working on my project actually get the work done. So there is definitely something to be said for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think to Thomas's point about game dev changes like every 5 to 10 years, I would say it's even faster than that these days. Maybe even like 6 months to a year. We see, at least here where I cover games, we see new genres kind of blow up, new gameplay or new mechanics kind of take to the forefront, and then that becomes a new standard. For people watching me, I've lived through the age of all the Darkest Dungeon likes, deck building roguelikes. We're now kind of in Vampire Survivor or Bullet Heaven territory, and I'm sure in the next 6 months or so there'll be a new design. And again, like to each of your points, the problem I think when people look at kind of like a game dev course or going to school for game dev is that it kind of feels like it's stuck in the, I guess, the quote unquote now. That you're trying to teach someone, okay, what is game design going to be like in 2 years? How do you apply this information? And for if you're just like taking, I think, like basic courses, or again, like looking at things from the, I guess, from the further or the far side of things, you're not really learning. Again, like to the point I was saying earlier, that if let's say you really want to make a platformer, unless that most likely a game dev course is not going to have a specifically, intro to platforming or an intro to first person shooter or intro to RTS. So you do need to look outside, which again, in today's world, it is probably it's easier than ever to find these resources and again, find like-minded people. I'm going to really date myself and to any, teens or college students watching this, but again, I grew up before the internet blew up, before there was Discord and Twitter and all that. And it is a scary time for everyone watching. But the fact that we're able to have this conversation on Discord is certainly proof positive that it has grown a lot. And I guess to my next question, in terms of, I guess, going to class or like picking what aspects of game dev, what attracted like each of you to your respective fields of study, or doing game production, doing sound marketing, or doing coding and that kind of thing?
For me, I honestly came into Drexel undecided. It wasn't until COVID hit that I decided to be a game design student. I was looking into game design majors in other schools, but I wasn't sure if that's what I wanted to do. So kind of being an undecided major at Drexel, it was perfect for me because I knew that I would move towards game design. Now that I'm in game design, I just have found that I really like sound design. I was always into music. I was in choir, and I found it to be really fun and really nice. Now I'm in a place where I'm on a team, and sound design is important, but not a job that needs to be filled immediately, right? So being the marketer, being kind of this half of a project manager, it's really fun. I just kind of like filling in the roles that are necessary for the team, or just the things that can get us the furthest. And learning from those experiences, I've realized just how much I like it. So that's me.
Yeah, so I think I could probably talk for days about why I love to code. So I'll give you the spark notes. For me, it really is just still the excitement of being able to sit at a computer and have basically limitless possibilities to what I can do, and to be able to materialize that or design that just from ones and zeros or lines of code. It never stopped being exciting for me, and I don't think it ever will. It also is such a like in such an intangible way. It's a great escape from life that sometimes can be confusing or esoteric. Just to be able to just sort of engage yourself in this grand logic puzzle that we're all throwing ourselves at. Uh, it's excited me when I was 12, and it excites me now. So,
We're all in the same team of game designers outside the classroom. So, like, both of these guys, I would not be here without them. Like that, as a producer, I feel like I often get an imposter syndrome because, like, when it comes down to it, I'm not the one producing the product like these two. Um, but when it comes to production and why I got into it, I think it really came down to when you think of your stereotypical gamer or your stereotypical game designer. Even like I'm immersed in the community. There are great people, but sometimes they don't always advocate for themselves. Sometimes they don't always know to stick together and band together and to create these amazing works. And the classroom surely facilitates it, but again, it's hard to break the ice after 2 years virtual. So I mean, my role as producer is really to get these talented people in a room and say like, what can we accomplish together that would be more important or more impactful than what we can accomplish alone. And so I find great joy in that, just bringing people together, and at the end of the day, combining people to make something greater than the sum of their parts.
Mm-hmm. Yep, and again, I have interviewed developers for the past 10 years now, and I've heard all kinds of stories of what drives them to get into game dev, what got them started, and it's such a very fascinating industry in terms of meeting people, in terms of their backgrounds and stories. Now, I think for my next question for the three of you, with going to classes and like learning, I'm kind of curious from an actual like a design standpoint. Again, over the last few minutes we talked about how nebulous game design is as a subject. At Drexel, like what are they kind of like teaching, like when it comes to the actual like learning design? Not so much like the coding or the program, but actually learning what gameplay is. What are the classes, or like what's the structure of that like? Because again, like a lot of my audience are either no longer in school, or they're people who are interested in learning design or finding courses and so on.
I think it's tough because our game design major is like 50 to 100 people, I want to say, per year. So most of our classrooms run in about 20 people. But for like, there's some like we took like a game history course, which I think was really great, and that was one of my favorites. That was done in like a lecture hall because they were able to pull more weight. But most of our game design classes are, we we go in, we introduce ourselves, and then we get right into the source material. And I think the topics, again, it's hard to really pinpoint one, but like we kind of hop all over the place. We've got like a cinematography class. That's one that I really remember and stood out to me. That we took freshman year spring. That we hopped in Unreal Engine 5, or not 5, sorry, wasn't out yet. Unreal Engine 4, and we messed around with models and lighting, and we had to like make a cinematic trailer using all the features in there. But like I haven't touched that since that class, so that kind of just shows you the level of variety we get, and sometimes not variety, but yeah, that's my take on that.
Yeah, I feel like in terms of the nuts and bolts, what we actually learn, it really is. A lot of the courses are I found they're mostly 101 courses in other fields. So the animation course I was taking, I mentioned before, was a 101 in the animation side of 3D animation. A lot of design courses that basically just get your feet wet on all these things. And then the core game design classes might cover something that's exclusive to game design, but more often than not, classes will take you across the wide spectrum in terms of game design. And then it's sort of up to you to take what you've learned and go forward with it, or leave it on the cutting room floor. Yeah, that's what I've found, at least.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Braden's point. You've got to take what you can. As I was saying earlier, there's going to be some classes that you don't know why you're there. People think they're helping, and maybe they are helping other people, but they might not be helping you. So just take what you can from each experience. Every negative experience can be a positive educational outlook, I feel like.
Mm-hmm. And like we go to Drexel, and I guess to give some context about what that kind of crucible is like. So we have one of our teachers. He teaches at Drexel, and he also teaches at University of the Arts. University of the Arts, he does a 15 course, you get 15 classes in that course. At Drexel, they're all 10 class courses, and he's teaching the same class. It's just at our school, he only gets 10 classes to, get the concept across, which is 2/3. Like, are you kidding me? That's not even the full scope. So it definitely feels like game design here is a sampler platter. And you're gonna find what on that platter you like and what you don't like. And I think, like, again, Drexel's unique because we have co-ops. And that's very much the mentality of the co-op. You go out there into the world and you figure out what you do like and what you don't like. And then so hopefully the value that you get out of this 5-year endeavor is you now know what you want to do as a career.
And I think to that point, I think that's a really important aspect. It's something that I talk about a lot in my presentations when I talk to like teens and kind of like the junior high crowd in terms of it's very important when it comes to game dev to kind of figure out what you want to specialize in. What do you have an interest in as early as possible? Because there are some people who don't get into game dev until, 30s and 40s. And while there's nothing wrong with that, it does leave you in a far riskier position in terms of kind of like that safety net of being able to mess around and do something, as opposed to doing something like I've seen the junior high kids who are making like small games. Again, college students have a lot more opportunities these days to work on prototyping and to make something using free engines. And the more experience you get, I think that's the one thing any game developer will tell you, is that experience really matters in this space. Because it's oftentimes not what you do know that's going to come back to hurt you, but it's all the things you had no idea about before you did your project, or after you tried marketing and releasing it, that, it can mean the world of difference on whatever you do after that.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you said that, because that's why we joined the Entrepreneurial Game Studio. It's not a student-led club. It's a club run by the Excite Center over here at Drexel, which kind of specializes in this emergent kind of student ambition. So we joined this at the beginning of our sophomore year because we were like, the best chance of us getting a job is not to graduate with all A's, it's to show that we've worked on games as a team for 4 years and produced 4 games. And that's our plan right now, and we're sticking to that plan pretty well. We just finished up sophomore year, finished a game, we're going into our pre-junior year, and we recruited more people, we're getting more momentum. And so like I very much think that when we go, if our endeavors don't pan out, at least when we go to the job market and we show our resumes and we show that, oh no, it's not like we were just going to a school for 5 years, we also have been getting work experience for 4 of those years. So I think that's so important. It's like, throw yourself out there as much as possible, get as much experience as possible. It's not just about watching a lecture.
Yeah, totally. And to the point about just time and time in general, at Drexel we are on a quarter system, so that's 10 weeks per round of classes. And honestly, sometimes it feels like you're at a sushi restaurant, just like take a bite, move on to the next one, take a bite, move on to the next one. It's crazy. And if I'm being honest with myself, it took a long time for me to sort of come to terms with that. For the first 2 quarters, I just sort of coasted by and treated it like it was normal classes. But I would just say, in the Drexel game design community and in the greater game design community, just start. Just open your computer and start, especially if you're on the coding side of things, because everything's out there. All the resources are out there. Just start, because the industry is going to keep moving. And if you want to get a piece of it, then you have to move as well.
I definitely agree. Experience is experience, and something negative or positive, it's experience. Something I've been saying a lot recently, that I think I don't know, saw on a movie or something. Nothing happens if nothing happens. So if it's 1% of your energy that you spend 10 minutes a week working on game design, at least it's something, and you're starting somewhere. As you were saying, I feel like as college students in this generation, we do have a pretty hefty privilege coming into game design, considering how far the industry has come. So I just think in classes, if it's a bad class, experience it. If it's a good class, experience it. If it's EGS, experience it. Nothing happens if nothing happens. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. And again, like as to Ethan's point about having that work experience before you go out and looking for jobs, because again, this is a very saturated industry in terms of people looking for work, and a lot of indie developers I've spoken to went indie simply because, well, I can't find anyone who wants to hire me, but I can make games. Why not make games for myself? I've done it for throughout college, throughout high school. And again, like one of the biggest points that I've said many times here is that you really need to get that practice in. Like your first game is never going to be that $1 million success. I have tried to hammer that point home to like every student and every excuse me, parent who's like watches my talks, because there's still that tendency. I think people think that game design is the get rich quick scheme. I make one amazing game, it blows up like Among Us, we all retire 3 years later. It doesn't work like that. Even to those successes, they still tend to struggle when it comes to what they're going to do next. And what does a 10-year plan look like for a game dev studio?
Yeah, and I think that's, within our sphere at Drexel, I think that's something that our particular group has really, capitalized on. It's this idea that, nothing's gonna be perfect first.
Mm-hmm.
I think we learned a lot from our first game, and if we had said, well, gee, it's never gonna be Dark Souls, or it's never gonna be, it's that we'd be selling ourselves short of a year of progress. So it's and like one of our mentors over in the EGS sphere is constantly talking about that. Like, you're in college, make a game per year, because you'll be amazed where you are at year 5 game compared to your year 1 game. And like to your point about like games blowing up and the get rich quick scheme, I feel like that dilutes the integrity of game design altogether. I mean, it's just like when you break it down, it's like, yes, at the end of the day, game design is still an art. It's still games are still an art, and so for every magnum opus, you've got 5,000 mobile games that are really just a vehicle for in-app purchases. So it's about it for me. Our success is really just about showing that the art can still pay the bills, and it's about like us making that product.
And I think
I would say,
no,
I would just say that games being Ethan saying games being art is honestly very validating, because that's sort of how I treat game dev. Like, this is my art. This is sort of like where I put a ton of time, energy, and self into. So if I go to a play test session and someone's testing my game and 20 people say, "Oh, this is awesome. This is great." That has so much more value to me than, I don't know, 100 copies sold. And maybe that's naive, and it probably is because I'm in college, but like, I'm not in this to make money. I feel like there's a million other careers that would pay more for a lot less effort. But this is where my passion lies. So money is usually never first on my list of considerations for starting a game dev project.
And that's my role in the team.
you do need at least someone to be thinking about the money, unfortunately.
Sure, yeah.
And let it be one person. Let the artists run free. That's how it should be.
And I think, like, for me, this will kind of like separates me from a lot of other people who cover video games, is that despite being on YouTube and writing and all that, I definitely lean more towards kind of like the academic and the learning side of game design. Sorry, my voice. Another lesson is when you do a lot of talking for all kinds of videos and interviews, your voice will die on you very easily. But for me, like, I have played games, I have played prototype builds, alpha builds, I've played games from other student projects as well, not in the Philadelphia area, but around the world. So, like, to me, like, my eye always aims towards design. Like, I could care less if your game is using, the latest Unreal Engine, or if you're trying to be the next Dark Souls or the next No Man's Sky. But even with that said, though, I think that's still kind of a niche when it comes to the grand scheme of things. Because there's still a lot of people who look at game design And it's very hard, I think, to put into words what makes a game good or bad. And as we said, like video games or a video game is an art form, but there's still a lot of foundational and structural stuff you need to learn if you expect that game to do well. Because, like, my first design book on platformers, I said that the platformer genre has been around for so long that everyone thinks it's a very easy genre to make a game in. It is not, and it's even harder to try and make a competent platformer, let alone, a Celeste, a Super Meat Boy, or a Mario.
Yeah, that's a great point. And when like you get my brain chugging now, because it's like I think about game design juxtapositioned to film. Like no one's like, oh, I could make that film. No, they understand that there are years of understanding the art or the science of how to make a good film. I feel like, yeah, that is very much a misconception about specifically platformers. But like games in general, it's like, oh, if I have the coding skills, then I can just kind of make it happen. But there is a lot of design thinking that has to go behind it until you can make a product that other people are actually going to want to play. And you say that's like kind of a niche in what you do, in like the space that you're in is thinking about design. And I think that is still a niche in academia too, because like I said, it's hard for a school when they grade on papers and stuff to be like, oh, great job, you understood the code, but this wasn't a good game, sorry, you get a C. Like, imagine if a teacher did that to you, that would crush you. But I kind of wish art school did that, like there's a difference between a good product and a bad product at the end of the day. So I don't know, that's my 2 cents on that. But
and
Oh, sorry, I keep interrupting.
No, it's okay. It's that delay in the chat.
Yeah, yeah. How I feel about it is when I started doing coding and that side of things, I didn't really make games. I made little programs for my computer that would do tasks for me. But when I started doing game dev, it was a hurdle to sort of figure out when I was done, when the product was good, when I could stop. And a lot of seasoned veterans of the game dev industry are like, just make it fun. And you can hold steadfast to that for a lot of games. Action games, puzzle games, pretty much anything that requires dexterity or reflexes. But even that's starting to change. I mean, story games have transformed an entire generation of gamers, and now they want story. They want to be emotionally moved by characters and plot. So it's sort of tough. But I would just say try to find a niche of players and cater to that.
Do you have any thoughts, Thomas?
I really just agree with what both of them said. I feel like I don't want to do any repetition, but really what Braden just said at the end there definitely is true.
Yeah, and I think to Braden's point there, I think that's a really salient one about how the market, I think, has really shifted. Again, when I was growing up playing games on the Nintendo, Super Nintendo, action and platforming was it. That's what defined a good video game. Did you make a Mario? Yes or no? That evolved into, of course, we had survival horror, we had Grand Theft Auto. In the 2010s, we had Call of Duty and Fortnite and so on. But in that same space, we've seen the rise of story-driven games. A game that I've been playing lately, I was a teenage exocolonist. It's kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure style game. A Disco Elysium from like a year or so ago. That there are calls for more than just saying, is this a really good action game? Can you, run, jump, and shoot? And if it, yes/no, pass or fail, doesn't really work anymore these days.
Yeah, it's definitely getting there in complexity, which it should. It's an evolution of the medium. like it's tough because it's like I say games are an art. So it's hard for me to say like, oh, this is definitively better, especially when it's like like and Tommy being like, oh, we don't want to repeat ourselves because like we are very three like-minded people when it comes to game design, but we still all have very different genres that we like dipping into and things that make us tick when we play games. So it can be hard because it's like it's like if like at the Oscars they have different genres that they show off. In Game Awards they have different genres that they show off, and it's like I'm only watching for this specific genre. It can be kind of hard to speak broadly on like what makes all games good. But it's it's kind of I that's not where my specialties lie.
And I think that's one of the advantages I have interviewing developers. I have interviewed everyone from action developers to RPGs to novels, adventure games, and every genre is completely different. And that also means every genre has its own kind of rule set and language you have to learn. And again, like going back to the earlier point about why it makes game dev such a hard field to study, is that you can spend 5 years of your life making a platformer or studying platformers. That means you go back to zero almost when it's time to make a first person shooter. Or if let's say you want to make a role playing game. Platforming doesn't quite necessarily translate. And one of the traps I see from a lot of like developers who are just starting out and kind of like making their first big game is saying, well, we worked on platformers, surely we can just immediately translate that into a racing game. Or what if we build a racing, cooking, first-person shooter? We've played these three genres. Surely it's 1, 2, 3 to combine them. and to every indie dev watching this, right? I know the three of you are soon, so you can't feel it, but I can feel like they're having chest pains as I just said that sentence to them.
And it's funny that you bring that up because it's like our first game was a top-down shooter on mobile, and this next one we're making is a 3D puzzle Portal-esque. But I feel like we as a game design group have the liberty of doing that because we're in college and we're experimenting and we're seeing what sticks. And we also doubled our team size. Like we brought in the people who understood the puzzle. So but that's a great point. Like you look at a big studio like Firaxis. That's the one I follow because I love 4X. But you look at a studio like Firaxis, they made Civ and XCOM, and that's pretty much it until they made Midnight Suns like recently. Like they stuck to their bread and butter, and they've had a sustainable, good team culture, and they can pay the bills because they know what they're good at, and they know that, and people know that when they make their next title, it's gonna be dynamite. So it's like it's again with like sticking to like I'm a production student, Braden's coding, it's sticking to the genre that you know that you can do well. So I think there's definitely some overlap there.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like from the coding side of things, the tools to create games are as accessible as possible. The fact that you can boot up Unity and follow a tutorial for about a half hour and have a platform engine is honestly astonishing. And also, since I've recently got into the ROM hacking scene with making games for older consoles, it is so much harder. I am very happy to be developing games in 2022. Nevertheless, that barrier of switching genres, switching pipelines, all that is still very much alive. But maybe I'm a little optimistic, but I would say especially if you're a college student, don't be afraid of that. Just give it a try. Make a prototype. The prototype doesn't have to go anywhere, but you'll gain even more experience if you do. And I've never had a project where the skills that I learned only stayed within that specific pipeline, even if it was minimal, even if it was one or two tricks to help me save time or be more efficient. That's still valuable. So practically, stick to what you're good at, but also experiment.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Braden's saying. I think that, as I was saying earlier, experience is experience. Also, like Braden said, I've never worked on a project where I haven't, gotten experience. Even if I did 1%, I got something out of it. So just like diving into different topics, I never thought I'd be interested in sound design, but now I'm, super into it. I never thought I'd be interested in marketing, and now I'm doing that. So, I'm sure as my roles continue to develop and as I move on, there'll be more tasks or things I'll want to do, just because I didn't know I wanted to do them to begin with.
Mm-hmm. And again, it is always changing. And to Ethan's point about being able to kind of do this mixing and completely changing the genres, it is fine to do that when you're in school. That is definitely the best time to start saying, let's go from a racer to a role-playing game to a tabletop game, because you have that safety net to, well, screw up if it does happen.
Mhm.
There are a lot of developers out there who, unfortunately, they don't. And they run into that situation where, and again, this kind of gets at the heart of game dev itself, that it is very hard for a lot of studios to sustain themselves 4, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Ethan mentioned Firaxis a few minutes ago. I mean, Firaxis has been like a mainstay since the 90s. The first game I played of them was Civ 3. And it is they stuck to it. And more importantly, they were able to keep producing successful products. And that, I think, is one of the most important lessons, especially for college students, that you have to be able to say to yourself, how do we improve? How do we go from, game A being, let's say, a 3 out of 10 to our next game being a 5 or a 6? And how do we keep iterating and improving upon that? Because and here's my lesson to the three of you, here's my, scary lesson. Consumers do not care where you come from, what your skill level is, how long you've been working on a product. They care about what they see on that store page. And if you can't produce something that resonates with them, all the work you've spent, it doesn't matter. And unfortunately, it's something again, you're talking to someone who has played, I think I'm up to several thousand games over the last 5 to 7 years now. I have seen a lot of amazing games that they disappear. They come out, no one picked it up, and I love it. I can shout it out from the rooftops, but again, one person loving your game, it unfortunately doesn't pay the bills.
Yeah, and like you were saying at the very beginning of this, it is a very, very saturated market. And again, that's my job on the team, to be like, yeah, this is where we were last time, and here's where we need to be this time, but also to say, it's a very saturated market, and putting our product out there is not going to mean instant money and I think our team is really good about managing those expectations and saying we'll be happy if we get one person to download it. So and that's where it comes into where it's if you're serious about making your game successful, it's not just about having a programmer and an animator and a 2D artist or a sound designer. It's about also having that marketing and that branding and that kind of momentum behind your product. So that's really hard for indie developers, especially solo indie developers. You always hear the story of Stardew Valley. You always hear the story of Undertale. But again, you just said you've played so many titles with what, under 100 downloads, and they might be gems, but they're not. They're not in the public eye.
I have played games that have 0 Steam reviews, that they've been out for 6 months to a year and no reviews on Steam. And it is unfortunately depressing to see that. I review Steam store pages. Like I said earlier, I have played student games, I play pre-alpha builds. Pretty much if a developer sends me a game, even if they have, no marketing whatsoever, I will play their game just to, again, learn more about game design. But as I've unfortunately have said, I feel like I'm more in the niche in that respect.
And
it's very hard, I think, and I'm sure for the three of you, it is hard to get people to playtest your game. To be able to put your game in front of someone who doesn't know you and say, okay, what do you think of it?
Yeah, it is certainly hard. And I feel like it's almost like we're set up to fail in that sense, because it's like right now we're in college and it's like a lot of people do know us. Like we can show our classmates the game and they'll say, "Oh, it's great." And that might inflate our egos over this 5 years, and then we go into the cruel, harsh world where you can't just network your way to getting play tests. So there's definitely something to be said for that, and I think that's a much larger discussion that needs to be had about, like, okay, what do you actually want out of academia and game design students? Because it's like there are some expectations that need to be managed, right? But I think when it comes down to it, it's you're building a team and then you're also building a game. So it's like I pride our team in having the ability to build that team. We've got a wide range of characters who are willing to step up and help this game be as successful as possible. Pre-development, during development, post-development. And it's like you can't just, as much as it's like experiment, get your game out there, but if you're actually trying to make money, you have to get your game out there, dangle it in front of consumers. You got to do a little dance. It's there's a whole system to that, and there's also an art, and there's also a science to that. So it can be daunting, stepping up from like indie to big production, but yeah.
And if we had the time, I could ramble about that very sentence for like the next 2 to 3 hours. Like it would go by in a flash there. As a quick time check, it is about 8:30 here. Do you guys have to get going in the next few minutes? Do you have like another 5-10 minutes just to wrap things up then?
Another 5 would be good, yeah.
Okay. In that case, we'll kind of wrap things up here. So, okay. Back to it in 3, 2, 1. Yep, and with all that said, we've been chatting now for just about an hour, and the three of you are college students. So you're not used to like being on these podcasts, but like for me, I can ramble and talk about design for hours and hours on end. I'm trying to get another developer roundtable schedule, and that's like 4 people in the industry talking about game dev at the same time. That if we didn't have limits on that, it would just go on for like an entire day. So I just have a few just like general wrap-up questions for the 3 of you, and then we will say goodnight here. So here's a question I'm going to ask the 3 of you. Again, as students, you've worked on your first project, you're currently planning your second one, and of course you're in a game dev program right now. One of the things that I've seen, at least from the outside, and as I've said over the course of our discussion, is that it feels like game design itself, again, separate from programming, separate from art, the actual understanding and learning of a game's mechanics and its systems is still not really being appreciated. But I do feel like things are improving, at least from the outside here. I'm seeing, again, more YouTube channels being built around game dev lessons. I'm seeing more kind of discussions outside of just specifically game designer spaces about the importance of this. So I want to get your thoughts as students. From your perspective, do you think that game design itself is becoming more of, I think, like a learning experience? Because again, like you have, teachers and advisors who grew up playing video games. They very well could have made games on their own. 15, 20 years ago, for any kind of game dev course, it was probably not that feasible to have someone with 10 years of experience teaching a course in 2000 or 2005. So I'm just curious, like, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Tommy, you got it.
Okay. I definitely think that game design and game development is definitely making its way into kind of the educational system. Serious games have been around for a minute, but you see them popping up more and more, especially in bigger studios like Minecraft's educational tools. I think that definitely children and people now are so connected to games and experiencing games as they are, watching a movie, reading a book. It's a different form of entertainment now. So it's naturally going to make its way into these other categories, I guess. So like specifically serious games, I think that that's just a great tool that in like 10 years, it'll be so common. And so, I just like well used for us to be using serious games as an educational tool specifically.
Hmm. And like you said, that with the teachers, like it was hard to find teachers to like teach this kind of stuff to us students.
Mm-hmm.
The it is still hard. It is still hard. You know, it's a lot of our teachers are just kids like us 3 or 4 years older, right?
Mm-hmm.
So once in a while, like, and I will praise from the rooftop. There are teachers that are actually from the industry because they know a thing or two, and they will tell you. And God bless them for actually coming to teach. But it's hard to it's hard to get those kind of people because if you're a successful game developer, you're gonna keep developing games. If you're an
Mm-hmm.
unsuccessful game developer, you might be looking for other options. So that's kind of what's happening there. But as for like freelance game designers, indie game designers, the information's out there if you're looking
Mm-hmm.
for it. Like in this day and age, like you've got channels like you, and you've explained that, and I think there's definitely we are definitely privileged to be in the age where games are now 50 years old as a
Mm-hmm.
medium, so it's not going anywhere.
Yeah, and I think to the point about the game industry sort of rounding the corner of half a century, I think we're at a very interesting turning point where we know it's not going anywhere and we have to decide where to take it. And I think just as a medium, I still feel like it's young though. I mean, it's been 50 years, but as a medium, mediums can take mediums of yeah, they can take centuries to sort of evolve into the modern equivalents that we know today. So I still have a lot of hope, and I still think the game industry has a lot of places it can grow.
All right. So I think with that, I think that's a good point to end on for our discussion. It has been great hanging out with the three of you tonight. Do you have any shout-outs to any other people on your team or anything you would like to mention before we end on?
Definitely shout out to the whole team.
Yeah.
We talked about Bridget earlier. Bridget, if you're listening, hey. And to the team and maybe future members, hey.
Yeah, we definitely struck gold with our team that we have right now. It's you know behind games there are people, and people make it happen. So we're very blessed to have our people.
All right. Anything from you, Braden?
Yeah, super proud of my team. Super proud of everyone I've worked with on this stuff. And yeah, basically what the other two said.
All right. Well, I think with that, we will end things for our cast tonight. It has been a pleasure meeting with the three of you. Best of luck with your next project.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having
so
us.
Thank you.
All right. So with that said, we're going to wrap up this episode of the Perceptive Podcast here. For the three of you or for your studio, do you have any social media sites, project, anything you would like people to look up or, link back to?
We're kind of in the middle of some social media right now since we're changing our games up. But right now, our Instagram is Play Starhound. We will have more updates for future games and Underdog Studios as a whole in the future. So if you definitely want some news from us, check out Play Starhound on Instagram.
All right. So, with that said, we're going to end things here. If you are someone working on a game, if you're a teacher teaching game dev, or you just want to come on and talk about game dev topic, I'm always looking for a guest for this series. Please reach out. My information is over there on the overlay. We have our Discord channel and Patreon, all that great stuff. With that said, come back for Dell discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where some there are in science of games. And to Ethan, Braden, and Thomas, thanks again, guys, for coming on.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
All right. So, with that said, everyone, have a great rest of your night and take care.